Landlords in St. Paul, Minnesota are selling their properties rather than dealing with the new rent control ordinance that was passed. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's another update to the story I had about the St. Paul rent control ordinance that was recently passed, okay? So, as I mentioned before, I think back in November, they had on their ballot a rent control ordinance in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, and it passed, okay? Now, the city of St. Paul has a higher percentage of renters within the city limits than they do homeowners. So obviously this was something that was bound to happen. And you know, renters, they might not know about the economics behind why rent control doesn't work. Okay, they just don't understand it. They see it as, oh well, my landlord rose my rent, the rents are too high, so we put this rent control thing and they can't raise our rents. You know, they look at it very simply, not realizing that, hey, if you put these price controls, these government imposed price controls on a piece of property, then it causes all sorts of other issues, you know, like suddenly you'll find out that, hey, landlords can't cover their own expenses. And if a landlord can't cover their own expenses, guess what they're going to do? They're going to sell those properties to owner occupants and get out of the landlord business. That means that there will be fewer properties on the market available for rent, and it'll make it less affordable for those who need a place. So yeah, people won't even be able to find a place they can afford to live within the city limits. That's terrible, but that's exactly what's going to happen. They also found out that, hey, by imposing these rent controls on brand new development, developers will not want to build new properties within the city limits because they realize, hey, we can't raise our rents so that we can make these developments profitable. And, you know, it makes perfect sense. So a lot of developers immediately began to back out. And that's the crazy part. They thought, oh, well, this is super simple. We'll just throw this in there. And, you know, now the city council, the mayor, etc., like, hey, we have to modify this, or we have to figure out some way to change this because it's going to destroy development and investment within our city. And that should have been obvious from the second it was even proposed. It shouldn't have even ever been on the ballot, okay? Now, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know, let me know some other consequences of rent control. You know, I mean, I always bring up the few that I know, but, you know, there's unintended consequences that I don't even think about. And, you know, for those who've dealt with rent control before, you know, what did you think of the whole system? Was it just so complicated? You know, all these complicated new rules and everything just make it so hard for small landlords in particular to be in the business that a lot of them are just like, hey, I just got to get out of this. Even owning one house in a place that is rent controlled just makes it unbearable, okay? Now, this article is coming from twincities.com, and it says, as rent control looms, small St. Paul landlords sell low-cost units and hike rents. All right, this is going to be an interesting article, so let's get into it. Andrea Suchi Shin owns 6 rental properties in St. Paul. At least half of them open to low-income tenants subsidized by federal Section 8 housing vouchers, but she's in the process of selling. Her townhomes in the Selby Dale neighborhood likely will be converted into condominiums. Her triplex off Congress Street on the city's west side is poised to be sold to a new owner who may not accept new tenants who rely on federal vouchers to pay the rent. It'll be up to him, Suchi Shin said. Right now, he says, the Section 8 tenant that's currently there can stay. Her reasoning for reducing her footprint in the St. Paul market: under the city's new rent control mandate that takes effect May 1st, she doubts she'll be able to keep up with cost increases for heat and utilities, property taxes, trash collection, and everyday maintenance. Yeah, and this is a great example right here. Okay, this is a small landlord, and she owns 6 rental properties in the city of St. Paul. Okay, and it says that, you know, some of them are actually townhouses, right? And so townhouses are interesting. You know, they'll be a strip of connected units, but you can sell them individually. So guess what she's going to do? She's going to sell them off and they will no longer be rental properties. Okay. So on top of that, she was an affordable housing provider who provided Section 8 housing, and now she's selling these properties. And guess what? The new landlord, if somebody comes in and they buy her triplex, they're going to say, hey, if I make this a Section 8 property, not only do I have to jump through all the hoops of Section 8, etc., but, I now have the rent control that I have to deal with. So I'm going to get this Section 8 tenant out there, mark this rent up to the highest level possible, and then I'll have to increase the rents 3% every year, or I will never be able to keep up with inflation even. So yeah, I mean, it's going to turn her property from an affordable property up into a market rate property. So yeah, the city of St. Paul is going to lose affordable housing due to their new rent control ordinance, even though it was supposed to do the opposite of that. They didn't even realize that, and she made a good point right here. She's not going to be able to take care of increasing costs for maintenance, for utilities, for taxes, etc. Okay, every single year, those things become more expensive. And that's just not only in the city of St. Paul, that's all across the entire country. As I've mentioned before, inflation in the United States was like 7% last year. And that might be on the low end. That was, average across the entire country. So city of St. Paul, up in Minnesota, they might have seen higher inflation, yet here they are and they're saying, well, our price control says that you can only raise 3%. And, so you just take a big hit in your butt because, your all your other expenses went up way more than 3%, but you can only raise your rents 3%. Yeah, you're doing great by landlords, and they're not doing great by landlords. That was sarcasm, sorry. But they are screwing landlords over with this rent control ordinance, and all rent control ordinances do this. I can't remember, I think it was New York, right? And New York City has had rent control for a long time. Well, they every year make a decision on how much they're going to allow landlords to raise the rent. And the last year they decided, hey, landlords can only raise their rent 1%. So they got screwed over even worse than St. Paul is proposing for landlords. Imagine only being able to raise your cost by 1%, and then, inflation is 7%. The cost of everything has gone up, and you're just expected to just take it. You're just taking a loss at that point, okay? What do they expect landlords to do? And New York State had one of the longest eviction moratoriums. So all of the prior year, you just got completely screwed over by tenants. You probably didn't get all of the rental assistance money that you're owed, and you are still behind. And there's nothing that you can do about it, okay? And this is a horrible situation. This is why I say, fight these rent control laws. Do not invest in a place that already has rent control in place. And don't be fooled by the fact that places that have recently, within the last few years, passed a rent control ordinance, that things don't look bad yet. Okay, that's one of those things that people say. They'll come back and they'll be like, "Oh, our rent control law passed 2 years ago, and see, nothing bad has happened yet." It takes about, 10 to 20 years, and then suddenly you start seeing the negative effects because you notice that, hey, landlords, they aren't maintaining these properties like they used to. Why is there so much deferred maintenance? Why is there so little investment in building new properties here within the city limits? Why are, the few properties that are allowed to be market rate, why are the rents so high on them? They suddenly notice that, hey, man, this is having a really detrimental effect. Why are the number of rental units decreased so much since when we started this? It's like all of a sudden now, 20 years later, they can see that, hey, that rent control thing that we passed, it didn't work, and it actually caused all of these huge amount of negative side effects. Crazy, isn't it? In fact, at her fourplex on the 1600 block of Charles Avenue, which could go up for sale soon, I'm right now not breaking even, said Suchi Shin, who saw her property taxes for the one location climb from $6,000 to $9,000 in the course of a single year. The heating bill was $618 for 1 month. I pay the heat. Everything is going up. Yeah, so her property taxes went up $3,000 in a single year. Yet you're telling her, oh, you could only raise rent by 3%. Crazy, isn't it? Critics cite consequences of cap on rent increases. Suchi Shin isn't alone. Even before voters approved a citywide rent stabilization ballot measure in November, some critics cautioned that the 3% cap on annual rent increases could have ironic consequences for the city's affordable housing. Instead of keeping prices down, they predict the mandate will lead to less affordability. That's because small landlords, unwilling or unable to make the numbers work, will sell their affordable units to new owners who do not accept federal housing vouchers, as well as national chains with stringent tenant screening policies. Apartments, once priced at levels that the working poor might get by on, could be converted into condominiums and sold, further reducing the supply of affordable rentals in the city. Some tenants are already getting hit with new utility charges. Yeah, and they just mentioned all the stuff that I already know. Basically, they're going to increase the screening criteria, make it so that, hey, we're not going to let subpar tenants into our properties anymore. If we can't raise the rents up to the levels we like, you're going to have a perfect credit history, perfect, tenant history, because we can't afford if you just stop paying rent. Okay, and that's what these national chains are going to do, and that's what the small landlords are going to have to do as well. And then we're going to sell our properties off to owner occupants or convert them over to condos or do whatever it takes so that we can still make money, and that's what we have to do. Okay, let's keep going. Rent hikes under rent control. Another irony: rent hikes. Before rent control, Steve Townley hadn't raised the rents on his 2 residential units in 3 years. After the rent control ballot measure's approval in November, he immediately and reluctantly boosted his tenants' rent by 3%. That's because the rent stabilization ordinance, as currently written, does not allow landlords to hike rents more than 3% between occupants and play catch up with the market. Other rent-controlled markets like New York offer vacancy decontrol, allowing landlords to effectively make up for lost time since a unit has gone vacant, but St. Paul does not. Yeah, if you can't raise rents between tenants to meet the market, then guess what? You have to raise rents every single year for the 3%, or you're going to just be so far behind that you'll never be able to catch up. Okay, so there's no more going to be nice landlords who, let a tenant move in and then they don't raise the rent until they move out. Okay, instead, it's going to be every single year expect to get your 3% rent increase. And that means affordability actually is going to decrease because of all this. And yeah, they're talking about, trying to add in vacancy decontrol and all that. But as of right now, none of that has happened. So yeah. This is what the result of rent control is, okay? Landlords are selling their properties or getting out of the rental business, and I don't blame them. So let's not let this kind of garbage rent control policy pass anywhere where, anywhere else.